The cold settles without movement, filling the space between the trees with a quiet pressure that does not shift or announce itself. Snow holds the ground in a pale, unbroken layer, its surface smoothed by time and wind into something that offers no direction. The forest stands in still alignment, each trunk carrying a thin weight of frost that softens its edges and absorbs what little light remains. Sound does not travel here. It shortens, then disappears, contained within the air before it can reach beyond its origin. Time does not pass in visible ways. It lingers instead, held within the same muted tone, where nothing changes and nothing signals that it ever will. There is no clear boundary where the cold begins. It is already present in the ground, in the trunks of the trees, in the shallow rise and fall of the land that no longer offers distinction. Distance becomes uncertain. What appears close resists approach, and what lies farther away seems to flatten into the same pale surface. The sky does not guide. It reflects the same muted tone, a quiet expanse without direction, pressing downward without weight. Even the wind, when it moves, does so without urgency. It shifts the surface of the snow just enough to remind you that movement is still possible, though it serves no purpose. Time does not pass here in any visible way. There are no clear changes to mark it. Light arrives, but it does not grow. It lingers in a dim, uncommitted state before fading again into a deeper shade of the same stillness. The cold remains unchanged through it all, neither increasing nor receding, only continuing. It shapes the rhythm of everything that enters it, slowing what would otherwise move freely, quieting what would otherwise carry. Even breath, if it were present, would not travel far. It would form briefly, then vanish, absorbed back into the air that refuses to hold it. The forest does not respond to this condition. It endures it. The trees do not bend or shift, they remain fixed, their forms gradually simplified by frost and shadow. Details disappear first. Texture follows. What remains is a series of vertical lines against a pale ground, repeating without variation, offering no indication of direction or distance. It is a place that does not guide, does not warn, and does not reveal. It simply continues, unchanged, regardless of what enters it. And for a time, nothing does. The space remains undisturbed, carrying only the quiet weight of itself. No voices move through it. No movement breaks its surface. Even the idea of presence feels distant, as though it belongs somewhere beyond the edges of this stillness. What exists here is not absence, but a kind of restraint, everything held in place, waiting without expectation, without any signal that something might begin. You notice, slowly, that this is not a place that allows entry in the usual sense. It does not open or receive. It does not adjust to what approaches. Instead, it remains exactly as it is, requiring anything that comes into it to change first. Too slow. Too quiet. To reduce itself until it no longer disrupts the surface. Only then does it allow anything to remain. And even then, it does not acknowledge it. As this continues, and the cold begins to shape what can remain and what must fall away, you may find yourself settling into its rhythm without noticing. If this quiet way of observing holds you, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you feel drawn to return to these still places again. You're listening to Echoes of War. What enters this space does not arrive all at once. It appears gradually, not as movement, but as interruption. A faint compression in the snow where none existed before. A line that does not belong to the natural pattern of wind and drift. Then another, set slightly apart, uneven in depth, uncertain in direction. They do not advance quickly. Each mark settles into the surface as though placed with care, though no intention is visible from a distance. The forest does not react to them. The cold does not shift. The marks remain the only indication that something has begun to pass through. The figure follows at a pace that seems slower than walking. There is no urgency in the movement, not because there is none to be had, but because urgency cannot survive here for long. It burns too quickly, demands too much, and the cold does not return what it takes. So the pace remains measured, each step placed where the last one has proven stable. The body leans slightly forward, not in effort, but in adjustment, as if the ground itself requires negotiation. Layers of fabric hold close to the frame, thick but insufficient, gathering frost where breath escapes and settles. The face is not fully visible. It is partially obscured, not by concealment, but by necessity. Cloth, ice, and the constant narrowing of the air have reduced what can be exposed. Only the smallest part remains uncovered, and even that seems temporary, as if it too will be claimed if left long enough. The eyes do not search widely. They remain focused on what lies directly ahead, not out of discipline, but because distance no longer offers useful information. Everything beyond a certain point fades into the same quiet uncertainty. You watch as the figure pauses, though it is difficult to say when the movement stops. There is no clear break between motion and stillness here. The body settles into place, but it does not rest. It holds. The breath becomes visible for a moment, then disappears, leaving no trace of its passing. Hands remain close to the body, not in comfort, but in preservation. There is no excess movement, no gesture that does not serve a purpose. Even observation is reduced to what is necessary. Nothing in the environment acknowledges the presence. The trees remain unchanged. The snow does not shift beyond what is disturbed directly beneath each step. The air continues to hold sound close, refusing to carry it. If there are others nearby, they are not revealed. If there is direction, it is not given. What exists instead is a narrowing of focus, a gradual reduction of the world to what can be immediately managed. This is how entry happens here. Not through arrival, but through adjustment. Through the slow acceptance that nothing beyond the immediate can be relied upon. That movement must be measured, that time will not guide, and that the environment will not assist. What remains is a series of small continuations, each one dependent on the last, each one uncertain in its outcome. And as this continues, you begin to understand that the cold is not something to be endured in passing. It is something that must be learned. The air that decides. The air does not welcome what enters it. It holds its shape without yielding, a thin, resistant presence that presses against movement rather than allowing it to pass. Breath meets it first, leaving the body in a small, visible cloud that lingers for a moment before collapsing back into nothing. The rhythm of breathing changes almost immediately. It becomes shallower, measured without conscious effort, as if the body understands before the mind that too much air taken too quickly will not be returned in the same way. Each inhale feels deliberate. Each exhale disappears without trace. The cold does not sit on the surface of the skin. It moves inward, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. What begins as sensation becomes pressure, not sharp, but persistent, pressing through layers of fabric and into the spaces beneath. Hands are the first to change. They lose definition before they lose function. The fingers stiffen slightly, not enough to prevent movement, but enough to require attention. Small tasks begin to take longer. Adjustments are made without thought, gloves tightened, grip shifted, movement reduced to what is necessary. She moves through the trees with a pace that does not vary. It is not slow by intention, but by requirement. Each step is placed where the ground has already proven stable, following impressions left moments before. There is no attempt to create a new path when an existing one can be reused. The body leans forward slightly, not to push ahead, but to remain balanced within the resistance that surrounds it. The weight carried is close to the frame, distributed in a way that minimizes movement, though even this careful arrangement begins to shift as the cold settles deeper. You notice how little of the environment responds to her presence. The snow compresses beneath her steps, but only where contact is made. The air does not carry the sound of her movement beyond a narrow boundary. Even the faint scrape of fabric against itself seems to remain contained, absorbed before it can travel. There is no echo, no continuation. Everything ends close to where it begins. It becomes difficult to judge distance, not because visibility is reduced, but because the usual cues have been removed. The trees offer no guidance. They stand in repeating intervals, similar in height and form, their surfaces dulled by frost. What might have once been distinctive is now reduced to pattern. She does not look far ahead. Her attention remains fixed within a limited range, enough to maintain direction, but not enough to invite uncertainty. The farther distance appears unchanged regardless of how long it is observed. It does not resolve into clarity. It simply remains. Time begins to lose its structure in this movement. There are no markers to measure it against. The light does not shift in a way that can be easily tracked. The body does not respond with clear signals of duration. Instead, time becomes tied to repetition. Step, pause, breath, adjustment, then again. Each cycle resembles the last, differing only in small ways that do not accumulate into anything that can be clearly recognized as progress. She pauses, though the pause is indistinct. It emerges from the same rhythm as the movement, a slight lengthening of stillness rather than a clear stop. The body remains upright, but the effort of maintaining that position becomes more apparent in the absence of motion. Shoulders settle lower. The head tilts slightly, not in observation, but in conservation. Even standing requires management here. There is no position that does not demand something in return. The cold continues without variation. It does not intensify or recede. It simply persists, shaping each moment in the same quiet way. There is no sense that it will change. No indication that it responds to time or movement. It remains constant, and in that constancy, it becomes the most reliable element in the environment. Everything else must adjust around it. What begins to shift instead is how she moves within it. Not by choice, but by necessity. The adjustment is gradual, but it does not reverse. What once felt like resistance begins to feel expected, then necessary, until movement without it becomes difficult to imagine. The body settles into a narrower range of motion, reducing what it asks of itself with each passing cycle. Arms remain closer to the sides, not out of restraint, but because wider movement no longer returns enough benefit to justify the cost. The head turns less frequently. The eyes shift instead, scanning within a confined field, conserving what little warmth remains where it matters most. She lifts a hand briefly, not in gesture, but to check what cannot be fully felt. The glove is stiff at the surface, a thin layer of frost forming along the seams where heat has escaped. The fingers inside move slowly, each motion delayed by a fraction that becomes noticeable only through repetition. There is no pain yet, not in the sharp sense. Only a dull absence where sensation once marked the edges of the hand. She presses the thumb against the palm, testing for response, then lowers the hand again, returning it to the position that demands the least from it. You begin to notice that sound has not disappeared entirely, but has been reduced to what is essential. The snow beneath her boots produces a muted compression, a soft, contained break that does not carry. Fabric shifts with a low, controlled friction. Breath, when it escapes, forms briefly in front of the face, then dissolves without movement. These are the only confirmations that action is taking place. Beyond them, the environment remains closed, holding everything within a narrow circle. Distance continues to resist interpretation. A cluster of trees ahead appears unchanged no matter how long she moves toward it. The spacing between them remains constant, offering no sense of approach. What lies behind fades quickly, not because it is hidden, but because it becomes indistinguishable from everything else. Direction is maintained not through landmarks, but through continuity. The path is known only because it has been followed, not because it can be clearly seen. The body begins to prioritize without instruction. Larger movements are reduced. Smaller ones are refined. Balance becomes central, not as a skill, but as a requirement for continuation. Each step is placed with a slight delay, a moment of confirmation before weight is fully transferred. The ground, though covered, does not always respond in the same way. Beneath the surface, there are variations that cannot be seen, only learned through contact. A misstep is not dramatic. It is simply more costly than it would be elsewhere. She shifts the strap at her shoulder, a small correction that takes longer than expected. The material resists adjustment, stiffened by the same cold that has settled into everything else. The movement requires both hands, then a pause, then a second attempt. When it is done, the body returns immediately to stillness, as if reclaiming what was spent. There is no excess in the action. No continuation beyond what is required. You notice how the rhythm has changed since the first steps. It is slower now, but not uneven. The pauses are longer, though they do not feel like interruptions. They are part of the movement itself, built into it, shaping its pace. Breath aligns with these pauses, settling into a pattern that no longer needs attention. Inhale, measured. Exhale, brief. Then stillness again. The body is no longer moving through the environment. It is moving with it, matching what is allowed. Nothing in the forest acknowledges this change. The trees remain fixed, their surfaces unchanged. The snow continues to hold its quiet form, disturbed only where it must be. The air offers no indication that it has been entered, no sign that it has altered in response. What has shifted exists entirely within the figure moving through it, a quiet recalibration that does not extend beyond the limits of the body. This is how the cold begins to decide. Not by force, but by subtraction. And what remains is what can continue. Distance without signal. The forest does not become clearer with time. It remains as it was at the first moment of entry, flat in tone, restrained in contrast, offering no depth beyond what is immediately present. The spaces between the trees do not widen or narrow in any meaningful way. They repeat with quiet consistency, forming a pattern that resists interpretation. What lies ahead appears unchanged no matter how long it is observed, as though the distance itself has chosen not to resolve. She continues forward, though direction is no longer something that can be confirmed visually. It is maintained through memory, through a faint awareness of where movement has already occurred. The path exists only in fragments, compressed snow, slight variations in texture, a line that holds for a moment before dissolving into the surface. Each step reinforces it, but only briefly. The wind, when it passes, smooths the edges, returning the ground to its earlier state. There is no lasting trace. You begin to notice how orientation depends less on sight and more on repetition. The body recalls the rhythm of movement, the angle of progression, the subtle lean that keeps balance aligned with the terrain. These small consistencies replace what would normally guide direction. There are no markers to confirm that the path remains true. There is only the continuation of what has already been set in motion. The light offers no assistance. It does not cast shadows that could define shape or distance. It settles evenly across the surface, reducing variation to a narrow range that does not shift with time. The sky above holds the same muted tone, neither bright nor dim, but suspended somewhere between the two. It does not indicate direction. It does not change in a way that can be measured. It remains constant, and in doing so, removes another point of reference. She pauses again, though the pause is slight. The head lifts just enough to take in what lies ahead, but the effort produces no new information. The trees remain where they were. The spacing does not change. The ground offers no distinction beyond what has already been learned through contact. The body holds this position for a moment longer, not in expectation, but in confirmation that nothing has shifted. Sound does not travel far enough to assist. There are no distant signals, no movement carried from beyond the immediate surroundings. Even if something were present at a distance, it would not announce itself in a way that could be followed. The air holds everything close, containing it within a limited range. What exists beyond that range remains unknown, not because it is hidden, but because it cannot be reached through the senses available. The sense of scale begins to narrow. What lies within a few steps becomes the only space that can be reliably understood. Beyond that, the environment flattens into a continuous surface, repeating without variation. The mind does not attempt to extend beyond this boundary. It adjusts instead, focusing on what can be managed directly. The larger landscape becomes irrelevant, not because it lacks importance, but because it offers nothing that can be used. She resumes movement, placing each step with the same measured care as before. The rhythm holds. The pauses return at regular intervals, built into the motion as a necessary component. There is no acceleration, no deviation. The body continues forward because it has not stopped, not because it is certain of where it is going. You watch as the path forms again beneath her steps, temporary and incomplete. It exists only as long as it is being made. Behind her, it fades quickly, absorbed back into the surface that does not retain what passes through it. Ahead, there is no visible continuation. Only the repetition of trees, of snow, of air that does not change. This is how distance behaves here. Not as something to be crossed, but as something that remains. The sense of direction does not fail all at once. It loosens slowly, giving way in small, almost unnoticeable increments, until what once felt certain becomes something that must be held together through effort. The body continues forward, but the idea of forward begins to thin. It no longer carries the assurance of progress. It becomes a continuation without confirmation, a line maintained only because it has not yet been broken. She adjusts her course by a fraction, not in response to anything clearly seen, but to a feeling that something has shifted. The change is slight, barely altering the angle of movement, yet it introduces a new uncertainty. There is no way to verify if the correction aligns with anything beyond the immediate moment. The trees ahead accept the change without resistance. They offer the same spacing, the same repetition, the same absence of distinction. Nothing signals whether the adjustment brings her closer to anything or moves her further away. You begin to notice how the body compensates for this lack of signal. The head tilts slightly, not to scan the distance, but to gather what little variation exists within it. The eyes search for irregularities, a branch that bends differently, a shadow that lingers longer, a break in the pattern that might suggest direction. These details appear briefly, then dissolve into the uniformity of the environment. They cannot be held long enough to guide. The ground beneath her shifts in ways that cannot be seen. Beneath the surface of snow, there are subtle changes in density and structure. Some steps hold firm. Others give slightly, not enough to cause imbalance, but enough to require adjustment. The body learns these variations through contact alone, adapting in the moment without forming a lasting expectation. Each step is a new negotiation with what lies beneath. Sound continues to remain close, but in its absence, something else becomes more noticeable, the presence of internal rhythm. Breath, movement, the faint friction of material against itself. These become the only consistent signals available. They do not guide direction, but they provide continuity, a sense that something is still occurring, even as the environment offers no external confirmation. She pauses once more, though this time the stillness extends slightly longer. The body holds its position, balanced between movement and rest. There is no attempt to listen beyond what can be heard. No effort to search beyond what can be seen. The pause exists not to gather information, but to maintain what has already been established. Direction is not rediscovered here. It is preserved through stillness. You watch as the weight shifts subtly from one foot to the other, a small redistribution that keeps circulation moving without requiring full motion. The arms remain close, conserving warmth. The head lowers again, returning focus to the immediate path. There is no indication that anything beyond this narrow field has changed. The forest remains fixed in its repetition, offering no assistance, no resistance, no acknowledgement. When movement resumes, it does so without decision. The step forward is not chosen because it leads somewhere, but because standing still cannot continue indefinitely. The body commits to motion again, following the same restrained pattern, accepting the same uncertainty. Each step reaffirms the direction only in the moment it is taken. Beyond that, it holds no promise. The idea of being lost does not emerge here in the way it might elsewhere. There is no sudden realization, no sharp awareness of disorientation. Instead, there is a gradual absence of confirmation, a quiet removal of signals that would normally define position. What remains is not panic, but a narrowing. The world reduces itself to what can be directly managed, and anything beyond that fades into irrelevance. This is how direction fades in the cold. Not through error, but through the quiet loss of what once defined it. And still, the movement continues. Lines that separate. The forest does not remain continuous everywhere. There are places where it thins without warning, where the repetition of trunks gives way to a quieter openness that does not feel like relief. The trees do not end abruptly. They recede, gradually, leaving wider spaces between them until the pattern loosens enough to expose the ground beyond. What emerges is not a clearing in the usual sense. It does not offer visibility or orientation. It simply removes the closeness of the trees, replacing it with a surface that extends further than before, but reveals no more. She slows before entering this space, though the change in pace is slight. The body adjusts without instruction, recognizing that the absence of cover alters something that cannot be fully defined. Movement becomes more deliberate, each step placed with greater care, not because the ground has changed, but because the space around it has. The air feels wider here, though it behaves the same. Sound still remains close. Breath still fades quickly. The difference lies in what is no longer present to contain it. You notice how the edges of this opening do not hold their shape. They shift depending on where they are observed from, blending into the forest without clear boundary. There is no line to mark where one condition ends and another begins. Instead, there is a gradual transition, a thinning that alters perception more than structure. The trees at the edge remain still, their forms unchanged, but the space between them stretches just enough to create a sense of exposure that was not present before. The ground carries fewer marks here. Snow lies smoother, less disturbed, shaped only by the wind that moves across it in shallow, uneven patterns. These markings do not hold direction. They cross and fade, forming lines that suggest movement without confirming it. What appears to be a path dissolves when approached. What seems to indicate passage reveals itself as nothing more than surface variation. She steps into the open without hesitation, though the body responds with a subtle tightening. The shoulders draw inward. The head lowers slightly, reducing what is exposed. The movement does not become faster. It becomes more contained, as if the absence of the trees has removed a layer of protection that must now be replaced through posture alone. The rhythm remains steady, but the pauses between steps grow fractionally longer. You begin to understand that this space introduces a different kind of uncertainty. In the forest, repetition obscured distance. Here, the openness does the same, but through a different method. The lack of obstruction allows the eye to travel further, but it does not provide clarity. The surface remains uniform, the horizon indistinct. What lies ahead appears unchanged, regardless of how long it is observed. The additional space offers no advantage. There are lines here that suggest division, though none are clearly defined. Slight depressions in the snow, subtle changes in texture, areas where the surface has been disturbed and then partially restored. These features do not form a coherent pattern. They do not guide movement. But they hint at something that has passed through, something that has altered the surface in ways that are no longer fully visible. She pauses again near one of these faint lines, her gaze lowering to where the snow has settled differently. The mark is shallow, almost indistinct, but it carries a variation that does not belong to the wind alone. It does not extend far. It begins and ends within a short distance, offering no clear direction. The body remains still as this is observed, not searching for meaning, but acknowledging the difference. You watch as she shifts slightly, stepping over the mark without altering her path. There is no attempt to follow it. No effort to understand where it leads. In this environment, such details cannot be relied upon. They are noted, then left behind, their presence adding to the quiet accumulation of uncertainty that defines the space. The openness continues for a time, though its duration cannot be measured. The forest remains visible at the edges, but it does not feel closer or further away. It simply exists as a boundary that may or may not be reached. The ground remains consistent, the snow unbroken except for the marks created in passing. The air holds its same quiet resistance, unchanged by the shift in space. This is how separation begins here. Not through clear lines or visible borders, but through subtle changes in how the environment holds itself. And in those changes, something begins to divide. The division does not announce itself as a boundary. It remains indistinct, present only in the way the space feels altered rather than in anything that can be clearly seen. The openness carries a different weight, not heavier, but more exposed, as if the absence of the trees has removed a layer that once absorbed attention. What remains is a surface that does not conceal, yet does not reveal. The body responds to this without instruction, narrowing its movement further, reducing what is unnecessary even more than before. She lowers her center of balance slightly, not enough to change her form, but enough to adjust how it meets the ground. Each step becomes quieter, though the environment would not carry the sound regardless. The change is not for concealment from others, but for alignment with the space itself. Movement here feels more visible, even if nothing is present to witness it. The openness creates the sense of being observed without confirming it. You begin to notice how attention shifts in this space. It no longer rests primarily on the ground ahead, but moves outward, scanning the edges where the forest holds its shape. The trees at a distance appear unchanged, yet they now carry a different significance. They form a perimeter, not a guide, marking the limits of where concealment might return. The space between them and the figure feels stretched, though it remains constant. The faint lines in the snow become more frequent, though no clearer. They intersect, overlap, and then disappear, leaving only partial impressions that do not sustain direction. Some are deeper than others, suggesting weight. Others are barely visible, their edges softened by the wind. None persist long enough to form a path that can be followed. They exist only as interruptions in the surface, reminders that the space has been crossed, but not how. She pauses again, this time turning her head slightly toward one of the edges where the trees gather more closely. The movement is minimal, contained within the same economy that governs everything here. The gaze holds for a moment, then shifts back to the ground ahead. There is no confirmation of anything beyond the immediate. The trees remain still. The air remains closed. Whatever may exist beyond the visible range does not present itself. You watch as the body makes another small adjustment, redistributing weight from one side to the other, maintaining circulation without requiring full movement. The arms remain close, hands positioned where warmth can be preserved. Even this subtle shift takes time, as if the cold has introduced a delay between intention and execution. The body accepts this delay, building it into the rhythm rather than resisting it. The openness continues to extend without offering resolution. The horizon remains undefined, the surface unbroken beyond what is directly beneath each step. There is no sense of approaching an end to this space. It does not draw nearer. It does not recede. It simply remains, holding the figure within it without providing any indication of how long it will continue. What begins to settle in this environment is not uncertainty in the usual sense, but a quiet awareness that separation exists without needing to be marked. The forest and the open ground are not divided by a line that can be crossed. They are separated by how they hold movement, how they shape attention, how they alter the body's response. The transition between them is continuous, yet the effect is distinct. She resumes her movement without hesitation, stepping forward with the same measured pace, carrying the same restrained rhythm. The path forms again beneath her, temporary and incomplete, fading as soon as it is left behind. There is no attempt to look back. What has been crossed does not retain its form long enough to be revisited. You notice that the space behind her no longer feels connected to the space ahead. Though they appear the same, they do not hold the same meaning. What has been passed through becomes distant not in measure, but in relevance. The present narrows further, drawing everything into the immediate field of movement and breath. This is how separation settles in the cold. Not as a line to be crossed, but as a condition to be carried. And once it is carried, it does not leave. The shape of a group. The presence of others does not appear all at once. It gathers slowly, not through clear visibility, but through small interruptions in the surface that begin to align with one another. A second set of impressions crosses the first, then a third, each one spaced differently, none forming a pattern that can be fully understood from a distance. The marks do not converge into a path. They overlap, diverge, and return again, suggesting movement that has occurred near the same space without revealing how or why. She slows again, though the change is minimal. The body adjusts in response to what is sensed rather than what is seen. The head lifts slightly, not to search the distance, but to acknowledge that the environment has shifted in a way that requires attention. The openness remains unchanged, the trees still holding their distant line, but the surface now carries more variation than before. You begin to notice how the marks differ from one another. Some are deeper, pressed with greater weight. Others are lighter, their edges less defined. They do not follow a single direction. They move across the space in separate lines, intersecting briefly before continuing on their own. There is no clear indication of where they begin or end. They exist only within this limited area, fading as they extend beyond it. The body remains still for a moment longer, not in hesitation, but in assessment. There is no attempt to interpret the marks beyond what they present. They are acknowledged as difference, not as instruction. In this environment, such details do not provide reliable guidance. They introduce complexity, but not clarity. She steps forward again, placing her foot between two of the impressions without altering her pace. The movement remains measured, though the attention shifts slightly outward. The eyes move between the ground and the edges of the space, holding both within a narrow field. There is no sudden awareness of proximity, no confirmation that others are near. Only the quiet suggestion that the space has been shared. You watch as another figure becomes visible, not through movement, but through stillness. It stands partially within the line of trees, its form blending with the vertical shapes that surround it. There is no clear moment of arrival. The figure seems to emerge only when the eye settles long enough to distinguish it from the pattern. Its outline is muted, reduced by the same frost and light that has flattened everything else. There is no signal exchanged between them. No gesture, no movement that acknowledges presence in a direct way. The second figure remains where it is, its posture similar, its form held within the same restrained alignment. The distance between them is difficult to measure. It appears close enough to recognize, yet far enough to remain separate. The space does not define their relationship. It simply contains them. You begin to understand that proximity here does not function as it might elsewhere. Being near does not mean being connected. The environment holds each figure within its own narrow field, limiting what can be shared between them. Even sound, if it were used, would not carry far enough to bridge the space in a reliable way. A third figure becomes visible after some time, positioned further along the edge where the trees gather more closely. Like the second, it is revealed through stillness rather than motion. Its presence does not alter the environment. It does not shift the balance of the space. It simply exists within it, occupying a position that feels both deliberate and uncertain. She continues forward, her path passing between the others without deviation. The distance remains constant, maintained without visible coordination. There is no formation in the traditional sense. No clear arrangement that can be defined. What exists instead is a loose alignment, a distribution of presence that does not rely on structure to hold it together. You notice how each figure maintains its own rhythm, its own pattern of movement and stillness. There is no attempt to synchronize, no effort to match pace or position. Yet they do not drift apart entirely. The space between them holds within a certain range, neither closing nor expanding beyond what the environment seems to allow. This is how a group begins to take shape here. Not through assembly, but through coexistence within the same conditions. And even then, it does not fully form. The group does not gather in a way that can be clearly observed. It exists through spacing rather than closeness, through the maintenance of distance rather than its reduction. Each figure occupies a position that feels neither chosen nor assigned, held instead by the quiet limits imposed by the environment. The cold does not encourage proximity. It restricts it. What warmth might be shared is balanced against what must be preserved, and the result is a separation that remains consistent without needing to be enforced. She adjusts her pace slightly as she moves between them, though the change is subtle enough to pass without notice. The rhythm holds, but the intervals shift just enough to avoid convergence. There is no need to stop, no requirement to acknowledge the others directly. Their presence is understood without confirmation. It exists as part of the same condition that shapes everything else. You begin to notice how attention distributes itself differently in this arrangement. It no longer rests solely on the ground ahead or the immediate path. It extends outward, not in search, but in quiet awareness. Each figure becomes a point within the environment, not distinct from it, but integrated into its pattern. Their positions are held loosely in mind, not tracked precisely, but not forgotten. One of the figures shifts slightly, a small adjustment of weight that alters its outline against the trees. The movement is minimal, contained within the same economy that governs all motion here. It does not signal anything beyond its own necessity. There is no response from the others. The adjustment is absorbed into the stillness without consequence. The faint lines in the snow now carry a different weight. They no longer suggest isolated passage, but repeated presence. The surface shows signs of multiple crossings, layered over one another without forming a single direction. These marks do not organize the space. They complicate it. They introduce a density that cannot be easily read, a quiet accumulation of movement that resists interpretation. She steps over one of these overlapping impressions, her foot settling into a space where the snow has already been disturbed. The ground responds more easily here, offering less resistance, though the difference is slight. The body registers it without emphasis, incorporating it into the rhythm without altering the pace. There is no attempt to follow these lines. They are used when convenient, then left behind. You watch as the distance between the figures remains constant, held within a narrow range that neither closes nor expands. There is no visible coordination maintaining this spacing. It emerges from the same quiet adjustments that govern individual movement. Each figure responds to the environment in similar ways, and in doing so, they maintain a loose alignment without needing to define it. Sound remains absent between them. No voice carries across the space. No signal is exchanged to confirm position or intent. Communication, if it exists, is contained within gesture so minimal it does not register as such. A slight turn of the head. A pause that extends just long enough to be noticed. These are not messages. They are continuations of the same restrained behavior that defines everything here. The group does not move as one, yet it does not fragment. It holds together through shared limitation, through the same reduction of movement, the same narrowing of attention. Each figure operates within its own immediate field, yet those fields overlap just enough to create a sense of continuity. There is no central point. No leader that can be identified through position or action. Authority, if it exists, does not express itself in a way that alters the pattern. She continues forward, passing beyond the second figure without looking directly at it. The distance is maintained. The rhythm remains unchanged. There is no indication that anything has shifted beyond the immediate act of movement. The others remain where they are, their forms steady against the muted background, neither approaching nor receding in any meaningful way. You begin to understand that this is not a group in the usual sense. It is a distribution, a quiet arrangement of individuals held within the same conditions, shaped by the same constraints, moving within the same narrow allowances. They do not gather to become something larger. They remain separate, even as they occupy the same space. This is how cohesion forms in the cold. Not through closeness, but through shared endurance. And even then, it remains fragile. Signals that do not travel. Communication does not begin with sound here. It begins with the absence of it. The space between the figures holds no voice, no call that carries beyond the immediate breath that forms and disappears. Even if a word were spoken, it would not travel far enough to reach with certainty. The air contains it, reduces it, returns it to silence before it can take shape elsewhere. What might be said is not lost. It is simply not extended. She slows again, though the change is slight enough to remain within the existing rhythm. The head lifts a fraction, not to search, but to register the positions that are already known. The others remain where they were, their form steady, their spacing unchanged. There is no need to confirm their presence. It is held in the same quiet awareness that guides movement. You begin to notice how communication shifts into what can be seen only if attention remains close. A hand lifts briefly, not above the shoulder, not beyond the line of the body. The motion is contained, reduced to a small adjustment that could be mistaken for something else if not observed directly. It does not point. It does not direct. It exists only long enough to be registered, then returns to stillness. Another figure pauses, the stillness extending slightly longer than before. The body remains upright, but the delay introduces a subtle difference in the rhythm. It is not a stop. It is a lengthening, a moment held just beyond what is required for movement alone. There is no visible response, yet the others adjust without acknowledgement. The spacing holds. The rhythm shifts slightly, then settles again. The ground continues to carry overlapping impressions, though now they begin to align in ways that suggest repetition within the same limited area. The marks are not organized into a path, but they show that movement has occurred here more than once. The surface bears the quiet record of presence, though it does not reveal intention. She steps into one of these repeated impressions, her foot settling where the snow has already been compressed. The movement requires less effort, though the difference is minimal. The body incorporates it without emphasis, maintaining the same measured pace. There is no attempt to follow these impressions as guidance. They are used only where they coincide with the immediate path. You notice how attention remains distributed, not focused on any single figure for long. Each presence is held within a narrow field, acknowledged without being fixed upon. The environment does not allow for extended observation of any one point. It draws the focus back to what is immediate, what can be managed within the next step, the next breath. The trees at the edge of the space remain unchanged, their vertical forms offering no variation. The openness continues to hold the group within its quiet exposure, though nothing within it signals threat or safety. It simply exists, shaping behavior through what it withholds rather than what it provides. She pauses once more, though the pause emerges from the same restrained rhythm as before. The body holds its position, balanced, conserving. The head turns slightly, not toward any specific figure, but across the space in a narrow arc. The movement is brief, contained, then still again. No signal follows. No confirmation is given. And yet, something has been shared. What is shared does not move outward. It settles within the same narrow space where it is first perceived, held without being extended beyond it. The absence of sound does not prevent communication. It defines its limits. What cannot travel must remain close, shaped into forms that do not rely on distance to exist. Movement becomes smaller. Timing becomes more precise. What is expressed is not sent. It is made visible only within reach. She resumes her pace, though the rhythm now carries a subtle variation. The pauses are not longer, but they are placed differently, emerging at points that do not align exactly with the previous pattern. The change is slight, nearly imperceptible, yet it introduces a quiet adjustment across the group. One figure slows fractionally. Another shifts position by a step that does not break alignment. There is no signal that marks this change. It occurs through continuation. You begin to notice how stillness functions differently now. It is no longer only a means of conserving energy. It becomes a form of presence, a way of holding position that can be read without being announced. A figure that remains still for a moment longer than expected introduces a variation that others register without turning toward it. The difference is absorbed into the shared rhythm, altering it without drawing attention. The hands remain close to the body, yet they carry a quiet role in this exchange. A slight lift, a shift of angle, a brief contact with a strap or edge of fabric. These movements exist within the necessary actions of maintaining balance and warmth, yet they hold an additional layer. They are not gestures in the traditional sense. They are adjustments that contain meaning only because they occur within a shared awareness. The ground continues to reflect repeated passage, though the impressions now form a denser field. Lines cross and recross, creating areas where the snow has been disturbed multiple times, then partially restored. These spaces offer less resistance, though they do not guide. They indicate presence, not direction. The body moves through them without preference, incorporating the variation without altering the path. She steps into one of these areas, her foot settling with slightly less effort, then continues without pause. The movement remains consistent, the body aligned within the same narrow range of motion. There is no attempt to trace the patterns beneath her. They are acknowledged only in contact, then left behind. You watch as the spacing between the figures continues to hold, neither tightening nor expanding. It is maintained through the same quiet adjustments that define everything else here. No one moves closer to confirm connection. No one drifts far enough to break it. The group exists within a balance that does not need to be enforced. The absence of voice begins to feel less like a limitation and more like a condition that has been fully absorbed. There is no expectation of sound. No sense that something is missing. What might have once required words has been reduced to timing, to placement, to the quiet alignment of movement within a shared space. The trees at the edge remain unchanged, their forms steady against the muted background. The openness continues to hold its quiet exposure, offering no variation beyond what is created within it. The air maintains its same resistance, containing everything within a limited range. She pauses again, though this time the stillness feels more defined. Not longer, not more deliberate, but held with a slight difference in weight, as if the moment itself has been marked in a way that does not extend beyond it. The others do not turn. They do not respond in any visible way. Yet the rhythm shifts again, adjusting to this small change without breaking. You begin to understand that communication here does not accumulate. It does not build toward clarity or resolution. It exists only in the moment it is perceived, then dissolves back into the same quiet structure that holds everything else. This is how signals remain in the cold. Not carried, not repeated, not confirmed. Only recognized, briefly, and then gone. The weight of stillness. Stillness is not the absence of movement here. It is something held. The body does not simply stop. It maintains a position that requires as much attention as walking, sometimes more. When she settles into place, the shift is gradual, a slowing that merges into stillness without a clear point of arrival. The legs hold their alignment, the weight distributed carefully so that no single point bears more than it can sustain. The arms remain close, not relaxed, but contained. The head lowers slightly, narrowing the field of exposure. The cold presses inward more noticeably when movement ceases. Without the rhythm of steps to circulate warmth, the body begins to register the environment in a different way. What was once managed through motion now settles into the surface, then deeper. The pressure is not sharp. It is even, consistent, spreading across areas that have remained still the longest. Hands are the first to respond again, their absence of sensation becoming more defined, their stiffness requiring attention even without movement. You notice how breath changes in stillness. It becomes slower, not by intention, but through the body's quiet attempt to conserve. Each inhale is drawn in carefully, held for a fraction longer, then released without force. The cloud it forms is smaller now, closer to the face, dissolving before it can drift. The rhythm stabilizes, aligning with the absence of motion, creating a pattern that holds without variation. The environment does not shift in response to this pause. The trees remain unchanged, their form steady against the pale ground. The openness carries the same quiet exposure, offering no indication that anything has altered. The air continues to contain sound, holding everything within the same narrow boundary. Stillness does not reveal anything new. It simply removes the distraction of movement. She adjusts her stance slightly, a redistribution of weight that occurs without visible effort. One foot settles more firmly. The other eases just enough to maintain balance. The change is minimal, yet it alters the way the body holds itself within the cold. These small adjustments become necessary over time, not to improve position, but to prevent the slow accumulation of strain that cannot be sustained indefinitely. You begin to notice how time behaves differently in stillness. It does not pass in the same way it does during movement. Without the repetition of steps to mark it, it stretches, losing its structure. The mind does not track it clearly. It remains within the moment, held there without progression. There is no sense of duration, only continuation. The figures around her remain in similar states, their forms fixed within their own positions. The spacing between them holds, unchanged. No one moves to close the distance. No one shifts enough to alter the pattern. Each body maintains its place, contained within its own narrow field, aligned with the same quiet restraint. A slight movement appears at the edge of the group, a figure adjusting its posture in a way that suggests the limits of stillness have been reached. The shift is brief, contained, then resolved. The body returns to its held position, the change absorbed into the larger pattern without disruption. There is no reaction from the others. The adjustment is understood as necessary, not as signal. The ground beneath them begins to show deeper impressions where stillness has persisted. The snow compresses under sustained weight, forming shallow depressions that hold the shape of each stance. These marks remain longer than those created in motion, though they too will fade with time. For now, they indicate presence more clearly than anything else in the environment. She remains in place, her posture unchanged except for the small corrections that maintain it. The cold continues its quiet work, settling into the spaces that have not moved, pressing inward with the same steady force. There is no escalation, no shift in intensity, only continuation. This is how stillness takes form here, not as rest, but as something carried. Stillness does not hold indefinitely. It begins to change from within, not through visible movement, but through a gradual shift in what the body can sustain. What was once held evenly begins to gather in certain places, concentrating without warning. The pressure in the feet deepens, not sharply, but enough to alter balance. The hands, already reduced in sensation, become less responsive to small adjustments. The body does not fail. It narrows further, reducing what it attempts to maintain. She makes a small correction, lifting one heel just enough to release what has settled there, then lowering it again into a slightly different position. The movement is contained, almost invisible, yet it restores something that had begun to fade. The shift is not repeated immediately. It is allowed to settle, to become part of the new alignment before another change is made. You begin to notice how these adjustments emerge at different intervals across the group. One figure shifts weight from one leg to the other, slowly enough that the motion blends into stillness. Another tilts the head slightly, then returns it to its previous angle. These movements do not break the shared condition. They exist within it, small recalibrations that allow stillness to continue without collapsing. The breath remains steady, though it now carries a faint irregularity. Not in rhythm, but in depth. Some inhales draw slightly more air, as if compensating for what has been lost through time rather than exertion. The exhale follows without emphasis, disappearing as it always has, leaving no trace in the air. The body does not draw attention to this change. It incorporates it quietly, maintaining the same outward form. The ground beneath her feet compresses further, the shallow depression becoming more defined. The snow yields slowly under sustained pressure, shaping itself around the stance that has been held. This imprint does not guide or signal. It records. It marks the duration of presence without indicating how long it will remain. You watch as attention remains contained, focused within the same narrow field. There is no scanning of distance, no attempt to extend awareness beyond what can be directly managed. The environment offers nothing new to interpret. The trees remain fixed, their forms unchanged. The openness continues to hold its quiet exposure, neither advancing nor receding. A faint shift in posture occurs again, this time in the shoulders. They lower slightly, releasing a tension that had not been visible before. The change is subtle, but it alters the way the body holds itself against the cold. Less resistance, more accommodation. The adjustment is not a sign of relief. It is a redistribution, a way of continuing without increasing the demand. The figures remain in place, their spacing intact, their alignment unchanged. There is no signal that stillness will end. No indication that movement will resume. The group holds within this suspended state, each body maintaining its position through small, necessary changes that do not accumulate into action. Time continues without measure. It does not pass in increments that can be tracked. It does not build toward a moment that can be anticipated. It remains within the same held condition, extending without revealing its length. The mind does not attempt to define it. It accepts the absence of structure, allowing the moment to continue without boundary. She remains where she is, her posture sustained through the same quiet adjustments. The cold continues its steady presence, pressing inward without variation. There is no escalation, no shift that signals change. Only the ongoing requirement to maintain what has already been established. You begin to understand that stillness here is not a pause between actions. It is an action in itself. One that must be managed with the same care as movement, the same attention to balance, to breath, to the limits of the body. This is how stillness continues in the cold. Not by remaining unchanged, but by adapting in place. And even then, it can only be held for so long. The first movement back. Movement returns without announcement. There is no signal that marks its beginning, no visible decision that separates stillness from action. It emerges instead as a slight release, a shift in balance that extends just far enough to become a step. The body does not accelerate into motion. It resumes it, carefully, as if testing whether the conditions that allowed stillness to hold will now permit continuation. She leans forward a fraction, transferring weight in a controlled progression that avoids sudden change. The foot lifts slowly, not high, just enough to clear the surface before settling again into the snow. The contact is deliberate, the pressure applied gradually, confirming stability before the rest of the body follows. The step completes without sound beyond the same muted compression that does not travel. You notice how the rhythm does not return immediately to what it was before. It rebuilds itself, one step at a time, each movement re-establishing a pattern that had been suspended. The pauses remain, though they now exist between steps rather than within a fixed position. Breath adjusts alongside this change, aligning with the renewed motion without drawing attention to itself. The others begin to move as well, though not in unison. One figure shifts first, a small forward motion that becomes a step. Another follows after a moment, maintaining the spacing without closing it. The group does not restart together. It resumes in fragments, each body responding to its own limits, yet settling into a shared rhythm that emerges through continuation rather than coordination. The ground receives these first steps differently. Where stillness had deepened the impressions beneath each figure, movement now redistributes that pressure, easing what had been held in place. The snow compresses again under each step, though the depth varies slightly as the body readjusts to motion. There is no instability, only a brief recalibration as weight begins to shift from one point to another. You begin to notice how the environment remains unchanged despite this transition. The trees hold their positions, their forms steady. The openness continues to extend without variation. The air retains its quiet resistance, containing sound within the same narrow range. Movement does not alter the space. It exists within it, subject to the same conditions that shaped stillness. She continues forward, her pace measured, her posture aligned within the same narrow limits. The arms remain close, the head slightly lowered, the field of attention contained. There is no attempt to expand beyond what has already been established. Movement here does not introduce freedom. It maintains survival. A slight hesitation appears in the step that follows, a moment where the foot remains suspended just long enough to suggest uncertainty. The ground beneath offers no clear signal, no variation that can be seen before contact. The body resolves this by committing to the step regardless, allowing the surface to respond as it will. The weight follows, and the motion continues without disruption. The rhythm stabilizes gradually. Step, pause, breath, then again. The pattern does not match what it was before stillness, but it holds in a similar way, consistent enough to be relied upon without requiring attention. The body settles into it, incorporating the changes that have occurred without needing to define them. You watch as the spacing between the figures remains intact, neither tightening nor expanding. The group moves again as a distribution, each individual maintaining position through quiet adjustments that do not draw notice. There is no visible leader, no point from which the movement originates. It continues because it has begun. The impressions left behind deepen where stillness had lingered, then lighten as motion carries the weight forward. The surface records this transition without preserving its details. What remains is a series of marks that indicate passage, though not the conditions under which it occurred. She continues, her movement steady, her form unchanged except for the quiet adaptations that have been absorbed into it. The cold remains constant, pressing inward with the same even force. It does not respond to motion. It does not retreat. This is how movement returns in the cold. Not as a change, but as a continuation. And even then, it carries what stillness has left behind. What returns with movement is not what was there before. The body carries the memory of stillness within it, and that memory alters how each step is taken. The range of motion remains reduced, the pauses more deliberate, the attention narrower than it had been at the beginning. Movement does not restore what was lost. It continues with less, adapting to the limits that have settled into place. She maintains the same measured pace, though the effort required to sustain it is different now. The legs respond more slowly, not from fatigue alone, but from the lingering effects of holding still for too long. The first few steps carry a slight resistance, a stiffness that does not disappear immediately. It eases gradually, not through force, but through repetition. You notice how balance becomes more central in this resumed motion. Each transfer of weight is handled with greater care, as if the margin for error has narrowed. The ground beneath remains unpredictable, its surface offering no visible cues before contact. The body compensates by reducing the scale of movement further, keeping each step contained within what can be controlled. The others continue in their own rhythms, though the variations between them become more noticeable now. One figure moves with slightly shorter steps, maintaining a higher frequency of pauses. Another holds each step longer before committing to the next. These differences do not disrupt the spacing. They are absorbed into it, the group maintaining its distribution through continuous, quiet adjustment. The air remains unchanged, holding sound close, limiting what can be perceived beyond the immediate. Movement does not carry farther now than it did before. The faint compression of snow beneath each step remains the only audible confirmation of action, contained within the same narrow boundary. She shifts her arm slightly, a small adjustment that realigns the weight carried at her side. The motion is controlled, deliberate, taking longer than it might have before stillness set in. When it is complete, the arm returns to its position close to the body, preserving what warmth remains. There is no excess in the action, no continuation beyond what is required. You begin to notice how the path ahead remains unchanged despite the resumed movement. The trees continue their quiet repetition, the openness offering no variation, the ground maintaining its uniform surface. There is no indication that progress is being made in any measurable sense. Movement exists without visible advancement. The impressions left behind begin to overlap again, forming a pattern that reflects the resumed motion of the group. These marks do not guide. They record. They show where weight has been placed, where movement has occurred, but they do not reveal where it leads. A brief pause emerges again, though it is shorter now, integrated into the rhythm of walking rather than standing. The body uses these pauses to recalibrate, to manage the balance between motion and conservation. They are not interruptions. They are part of the movement itself. The spacing between the figures continues to hold, though the subtle variations in pace require constant, small adjustments to maintain it. No one moves closer to compensate. No one falls back significantly. The group remains distributed, held together by the same shared constraints that shaped it before stillness. You watch as the body settles more fully into this resumed pattern. The initial resistance begins to ease, replaced by a steadier rhythm that can be sustained without drawing attention. Movement becomes less of an effort and more of a condition, something that continues because it has been established. The cold remains unchanged. It does not respond to the return of motion. It does not retreat or intensify. It continues its quiet pressure, shaping each step, each breath, each adjustment without variation. This is how movement persists after stillness. Not by returning to what was, but by continuing with what remains. And what remains is enough to keep moving. The body as measure. The body begins to define what can continue. What was once guided by distance, by direction, by the idea of reaching something beyond the immediate, now narrows into what the body can sustain from one moment to the next. Movement remains steady, but it no longer extends outward in the same way. It turns inward, measured not by where it leads, but by how long it can be maintained. She continues forward, though the scale of each step has reduced further. The lift of the foot is smaller now, the placement more precise, as if the margin for unnecessary motion has been removed entirely. The body conserves not only energy, but range. Each action is confined to what is required to continue, nothing more. You notice how sensation has changed. The hands no longer register the surface in the same way. Where texture once defined contact, there is now a muted response, delayed, softened, sometimes absent. The fingers move, but the awareness of their position follows a fraction behind. She adjusts her grip on the strap at her shoulder, not because it feels different, but because she knows it must be maintained. The action is guided by memory rather than sensation. The feet carry a similar shift. The contact with the ground is still present, but less distinct. The compression of snow beneath each step is felt as pressure rather than texture, a broad, undefined resistance that does not fully communicate the surface beneath it. Balance becomes more deliberate, relying less on immediate feedback and more on careful placement. The cold has not intensified. It has settled. It exists now within the body as much as around it, shaping how movement is perceived, how effort is distributed, how awareness is held. It no longer feels external. It has become part of the conditions that define action. You watch as she pauses briefly, not in response to the environment, but to the body itself. The stillness emerges from within, a moment where movement cannot continue without adjustment. The weight shifts slightly, redistributed across the feet, the posture altering just enough to relieve what has begun to gather. There is no visible strain, only a quiet recalibration. The others continue in their own rhythms, though the differences between them become more subtle now. Each figure has narrowed into a similar pattern of movement, shaped by the same limitations. The variations that once distinguished them begin to fade, replaced by a shared economy of motion. The ground continues to receive their steps without variation. The snow compresses, the impressions form, then begin to soften at the edges as the wind moves lightly across the surface. Nothing in the environment responds to the changes occurring within the body. It remains constant, indifferent to the adjustments being made. She resumes movement, though the pace is now defined more clearly by what can be sustained rather than what can be achieved. The rhythm holds, but it is quieter, more contained, as if the body has withdrawn further into itself. You begin to understand that distance has lost its meaning here. What matters is not how far remains, but how long the body can continue within the conditions that surround it. The forest remains unchanged. The openness holds. The air continues its quiet resistance. But within that stillness, something has shifted. The body has become the measure, and everything that follows will be defined by it. What the body measures cannot be extended beyond itself. It does not project forward or hold the past in a way that guides the next step. It remains within the present condition, responding only to what it can sustain at that moment. Movement continues, but its purpose has shifted. It no longer serves distance. It serves continuation. She adjusts her stride again, though the change is slight enough to remain within the established rhythm. The length of each step shortens by a fraction, the placement becoming even more precise. The body reduces its exposure to imbalance, keeping movement contained within a range that can be corrected without delay. There is no visible strain in this adjustment. It occurs quietly, absorbed into the pattern without interruption. You notice how breathing now carries a deeper significance. It no longer aligns only with movement. It defines it. Each step follows the rhythm of breath, not the other way around. Inhale, the body gathers what it can. Exhale, the step completes. The pattern holds, steady and contained, allowing motion to continue without drawing attention to the effort it requires. The hands remain close, their position unchanged, though their role has shifted further. They no longer guide through sensation. They maintain through memory. A slight tightening of the grip, a small repositioning along the strap, these actions occur without the immediate feedback that once informed them. They are performed because they must be, not because they are felt. The feet continue to meet the ground with the same controlled pressure, though the awareness of that contact remains broad and indistinct. Balance is maintained through caution rather than response. Each step is placed as if the surface beneath it cannot be fully trusted, even when it holds firm. The body prepares for variation in every movement, adjusting before the need becomes visible. You watch as the group moves within this same narrowed condition, each figure reflecting the same quiet adaptation. Differences in pace have diminished. The spacing holds not through adjustment, but through similarity. Each body has arrived at a comparable limit, and within that limit, they continue. The environment offers no variation to respond to. The trees remain fixed, their repetition unchanged. The openness carries the same quiet exposure, the same absence of guidance. The air continues to contain sound, to resist extension, to hold everything within a confined range. She pauses again, though the stillness is brief, emerging only as long as the body requires to maintain its balance. The weight shifts slightly, the posture adjusts, then movement resumes without delay. These pauses no longer extend. They have become part of the rhythm itself, integrated into the pattern of continuation. You begin to understand that the body is not only measuring what can be done, it is setting the limit of what will be done. There is no attempt to exceed it, no effort to push beyond what can be sustained. The environment does not reward such attempts. It does not respond to them. What continues is what remains within the boundary that the body defines. The impressions left behind reflect this narrowing. They are closer together now, more evenly spaced, forming a pattern that indicates reduced range rather than reduced pace. The movement remains steady, but it occupies less space with each step. She continues forward, her form unchanged except for the quiet refinements that have settled into it. The cold remains constant, its presence fully integrated into the conditions that shape movement. It does not press harder. It does not recede. It simply continues. This is how the body holds the measure in the cold. Not by expanding what is possible, but by defining what can remain. And within that definition, movement continues, one step at a time, without reaching beyond itself. The enemy without form. The enemy does not appear as a figure at first. It arrives as a difference. A small interruption in the continuity of the space, subtle enough to be mistaken for variation in the surface, yet persistent enough to resist being dismissed. The forest holds its shape, the openness remains unchanged, but something within that sameness carries a slight tension that was not present before. She slows, though the change is minimal, absorbed into the rhythm without breaking it. The head lifts just enough to allow the eyes to rest slightly beyond the immediate ground. There is no visible target, no defined movement to follow. only the quiet suggestion that the space ahead is not entirely empty. You notice how attention shifts in response to this. It does not widen. It sharpens. The field remains narrow, but within it, detail becomes more pronounced. The edge of a tree holds a slightly different tone. A shadow lingers a fraction longer than the light would suggest. These differences do not confirm anything. They introduce possibility. The body does not react with urgency. It adjusts. The steps become more deliberate, though not slower. Each placement carries a slight increase in caution, a more careful transfer of weight, as if the ground itself requires confirmation before it can be trusted. The arms remain close, the posture unchanged, but the alignment tightens, reducing what can be exposed. You begin to notice how stillness takes on a different quality now. When she pauses, the body does not settle in the same way it did before. It holds a slight readiness, a contained tension that does not extend into movement, but does not fully release either. The breath remains controlled, though it now carries a subtle restraint, as if each inhale is measured not only for conservation, but for silence. The others continue in their own patterns, though their movements begin to align more closely. The variations that once distinguished their rhythms narrow further, not through coordination, but through shared adjustment. The spacing remains, but it now carries a different weight, held more carefully, as if the distance itself has become part of what must be maintained. The environment offers no confirmation. The trees remain fixed, their forms unchanged. The snow continues to hold its surface without revealing what lies beneath. The air contains sound as it always has, refusing to carry anything beyond the immediate. There is no signal that defines what has shifted. And yet, the shift remains. You watch as her gaze returns to the ground ahead, not because the distance offers nothing, but because what lies there cannot be confirmed. The body does not extend itself toward uncertainty. It contains itself within what can be managed. A faint mark appears in the snow ahead, shallow, partially obscured, its edges softened by wind and time. It does not form a clear impression. It does not align with the patterns left by the group. It crosses them at a slight angle, then fades before it can be followed. She pauses again, her attention settling on this mark without attempting to define it. The body remains still, the posture unchanged, the breath controlled. There is no movement to follow, no shape to confirm. Only the presence of something that does not belong to the pattern that has been established. You begin to understand that the enemy here does not present itself in the ways that might be expected. It does not announce. It does not reveal. It exists within the same quiet space, altering it without becoming visible. This is how it begins. Not as a presence that can be seen, but as something that changes how the space is held. The difference does not develop into something clearer. It remains incomplete, never gathering enough detail to be held with certainty. The faint mark in the snow does not extend into a path. It does not repeat in a way that can be followed. It exists only where it was first noticed, then dissolves into the surface that surrounds it. The space returns to its previous state, though something within it no longer feels the same. She resumes movement, though the rhythm carries a quieter restraint now. The steps remain measured, the pauses integrated, but the attention has shifted inward again, holding what was observed without attempting to define it. There is no effort to confirm the difference. In this environment, confirmation does not come. You begin to notice how the body adjusts to uncertainty without reacting to it directly. The posture tightens slightly, reducing what is exposed. The alignment becomes more precise, each movement contained within a narrower range. These changes do not interrupt the rhythm. They settle into it, altering its tone without changing its form. The others continue as well, their movements reflecting similar adjustments. The spacing holds, though it now feels more deliberate, maintained with a quiet awareness that does not need to be expressed. No one moves closer. No one drifts further away. The distribution remains intact, shaped by the same shared condition. The environment offers no additional signal. The trees remain unchanged, their vertical form steady. The openness continues to extend without variation. The air contains sound as it always has, allowing nothing to travel beyond the immediate. The difference that was perceived does not return in any visible way. And yet, it does not leave. You watch as the gaze lowers again, returning to the ground where movement can be confirmed. The body continues forward, step by step, maintaining the same careful placement, the same controlled transfer of weight. There is no hesitation, no break in continuity. Movement persists because it must. A slight shift in the distance draws the eye again, though it resolves into nothing more than the same repetition of trees and snow. The mind does not hold on to it for long. It releases the need to define what cannot be sustained. What remains is the quiet adjustment that has already been made. You begin to understand that the enemy here does not require presence to exert influence. It does not need to be seen to alter behavior. It exists within the space as a possibility, shaping movement through what it might be rather than what it is. The body responds to this not with reaction, but with refinement, narrowing its actions further, reducing what can be exposed. She continues forward, her form steady, her movement unchanged except for the subtle adjustments that have settled into it. The cold remains constant, pressing inward with the same even force. It does not distinguish between presence and absence. It shapes both in the same way. The impressions left behind continue to form and fade, overlapping in a pattern that does not reveal what has passed through it. They hold no distinction between one presence and another. They record only that movement has occurred. You watch as the group maintains its quiet progression, each figure contained within its own field, yet aligned within the same shared condition. The difference that entered the space does not disrupt this alignment. It becomes part of it, absorbed into the same quiet structure that holds everything else. This is how the enemy remains in the cold. Not through form, not through confirmation, but through the quiet alteration of what is already there. And once that alteration is felt, it does not need to appear again. The return to the same ground. The ground does not change, yet it begins to feel familiar. Not in the way of recognition, not through memory of specific features, but through repetition that settles into the body over time. The surface holds the same pale tone, the same quiet compression beneath each step, the same absence of direction. And yet, something in the way it receives movement no longer feels entirely new. She continues forward, her pace unchanged, her posture aligned within the same narrow limits. The steps remain measured, the pauses integrated, the breath steady. But the contact between foot and ground carries a faint sense of expectation now, as if the body has learned the range of response it will receive. You notice how the impressions beneath her begin to resemble those that have come before. Not identical, not forming a path that can be followed, but similar enough to suggest that this space has been crossed more than once. The snow shows subtle variations, areas where compression has occurred, softened, then compressed again. These marks do not hold direction. They do not guide. But they carry a quiet indication of repetition. The trees at the edge of the space remain unchanged, their form steady, their spacing consistent. The openness continues to extend without variation, offering no new information. The air holds its same resistance, containing sound within the same narrow boundary. Nothing in the environment signals that anything has shifted. And yet, the body responds as if something has. She steps into a shallow depression where the snow yields slightly more than before. The movement requires less effort, though the difference is minimal. The body registers it without emphasis, incorporating it into the rhythm without altering the pace. There is no attempt to follow this variation. It is used, then left behind. You begin to notice how familiarity emerges not from what is seen, but from what is repeated. The angle of movement, the distribution of weight, the alignment of the body within the cold, these elements begin to settle into a pattern that does not need to be reconsidered with each step. The environment remains unreadable, but the body no longer attempts to read it in the same way. A figure ahead pauses briefly, its stillness aligning with the same pattern that has been established. The spacing holds, the distribution unchanged. There is no signal exchanged, no acknowledgement beyond the continuation of the shared rhythm. She adjusts her path slightly, though the change is minimal, guided not by any visible marker, but by the quiet sense that the ground has been crossed before in a similar way. The adjustment does not lead anywhere new. It aligns with what has already been established. You watch as the impressions left behind begin to overlap more frequently, forming a field of marks that suggest repeated passage without revealing its direction. The surface holds these traces briefly, then softens them, returning to its original state with time. The body continues within this pattern, moving through a space that does not change, yet no longer feels entirely unfamiliar. This is how repetition settles in the cold. Not through recognition, but through the quiet shaping of movement over time. And once it settles, the ground no longer needs to reveal itself. It only needs to hold what continues. Familiarity does not bring clarity. It settles into the body as a quiet acceptance, a reduction in the need to question each step, each pause, each small adjustment that allows movement to continue. The ground offers no new information, and yet the body no longer seeks it in the same way. What has been repeated becomes sufficient, not because it explains the space, but because it sustains motion within it. She continues forward, her pace unchanged, though the effort required to maintain it has shifted. The steps fall into a steadier rhythm, one that does not need to be rebuilt with each movement. The pauses remain, but they no longer feel like interruptions. They are part of the pattern, expected, integrated, no longer requiring attention. You notice how the body begins to anticipate the surface without fully sensing it. The foot lowers with a quiet certainty, prepared for the same broad resistance that has been encountered again and again. When the ground responds as expected, the movement continues without adjustment. When it varies slightly, the body absorbs the difference without breaking the rhythm. The hands remain close, their position unchanged, their function maintained through memory. A small shift in grip occurs, then settles. The action does not require confirmation through sensation. It follows the same pattern that has been established, repeating without needing to be reconsidered. The others move within the same quiet familiarity, their rhythms aligned more closely now, not through coordination, but through shared repetition. The spacing holds with less adjustment. Each figure maintains position through the same learned pattern, reducing the need for constant recalibration. The environment remains unchanged. The trees hold their vertical lines, their form steady and indistinct. The openness continues to extend without offering variation. The air contains sound as it always has, holding everything within the same narrow field. Nothing in the space reflects the familiarity that has settled within the body. And yet, the difference persists. You watch as the impressions beneath their steps overlap more densely, forming areas where the snow has been disturbed repeatedly. These marks do not guide, but they hold a quiet consistency, a reflection of movement that has occurred in similar ways over time. They fade at the edges, softened by wind, but they return again with each passage. She steps into one of these areas, her foot settling with slightly less resistance, then continues without pause. The movement remains steady, the body aligned within the same narrow limits. There is no attempt to follow these impressions. They are part of the surface now, incorporated into it, no longer distinct from it. A brief pause emerges again, though it is shorter, more contained, integrated into the rhythm of motion. The body holds for a moment, redistributes weight, then resumes without hesitation. The pause does not signal anything beyond its own necessity. You begin to understand that familiarity here does not lead to understanding. It leads to continuation. The body no longer seeks to interpret the space. It moves within it, guided by patterns that have been formed through repetition rather than observation. What lies ahead remains unknown, not because it cannot be seen, but because it does not need to be. She continues forward, her form steady, her movement unchanged except for the quiet ease that has settled into it. The cold remains constant, shaping each step, each breath, each adjustment without variation. This is how the same ground is crossed again. Not through recognition of place, but through recognition of pattern. And in that pattern, movement continues without needing to know where it leads. When the body narrows further, there comes a point where adjustment is no longer gradual. It arrives without warning, not as a visible change in the environment, but as a quiet reduction within the body itself. What could once be managed through small corrections begins to resist them. Movements that held their shape start to lose precision, not through error, but through a subtle delay that cannot be removed. She continues forward, though the range of motion narrows again, almost imperceptibly at first. The lift of the foot lowers by a fraction more. The placement becomes closer, tighter, contained within a space that can be controlled without requiring recovery. The rhythm remains, but it shifts inward, compressing rather than extending. You notice how the hands no longer adjust with the same consistency. Where small corrections once occurred without effort, they now appear less frequently, held longer between movements. The grip remains, but it does not refine itself in the same way. The absence of sensation has deepened, not completely, but enough to alter how the body maintains its position. The feet carry this change more clearly. The contact with the ground feels broader, less defined, as if the surface beneath has lost its edges. Balance is still maintained, but it requires a slightly longer confirmation before weight is fully transferred. Each step completes, though it does so with less certainty than before. The cold has not increased. It has settled deeper. It exists within the body now in a way that does not announce itself, shaping movement through absence rather than pressure. What is lost is not taken suddenly. It fades, leaving behind a narrower set of responses that must be relied upon without question. She pauses, though the stillness emerges differently this time. It is not a moment chosen for conservation or adjustment. It arrives as a necessity, a brief halt where movement cannot continue without resetting what has begun to slip. The body holds its position, balanced, contained, allowing the rhythm to stabilize before it resumes. You watch as the others reflect similar changes, though not at the same moment. One figure shortens its step further, reducing its movement to match what can be sustained. Another pauses slightly longer than before, its stillness carrying a different weight. These variations do not break the spacing. They settle into it, absorbed without disruption. The environment remains unchanged. The trees continue their quiet repetition. The openness holds its steady exposure. The air contains sound within the same narrow field. Nothing in the space reflects the narrowing that is taking place within the body. And yet, the narrowing continues. You begin to understand that there is no clear threshold where the body reaches its limit. There is only a gradual reduction, a quiet drawing inward that removes what is no longer possible, leaving behind what can still continue. She resumes movement, though the rhythm now carries a deeper restraint. The steps are smaller, the pauses more integrated, the body more contained. This is how the body narrows in the cold. Not through collapse, but through quiet subtraction. And what remains must be enough. The narrowing does not announce a limit. It continues past what might once have been recognized as one, reducing what the body asks of itself until even the idea of limit becomes indistinct. What remains is not a threshold that can be measured, but a condition that is carried, step by step, without extension beyond it. She moves again, though the transition from stillness is slower now. The first step takes longer to complete, the foot lifting with less height, the placement more deliberate, as if the motion must pass through a smaller space before it can resolve. The weight follows carefully, transferring with a quiet hesitation that settles only once contact is confirmed. You notice how the rhythm compresses further. The intervals between steps shorten, not because the pace increases, but because the pauses have been absorbed almost entirely into the movement itself. What was once a distinct moment of stillness now exists as a brief slowing within the step, a slight delay that does not fully separate from motion. The hands remain close, though their position is now held more than maintained. The small adjustments that once occurred without thought have become infrequent, not through choice, but because the need to conserve extends even to these minor movements. The grip does not weaken, but it no longer refines itself in the same way. The feet continue to meet the ground with controlled pressure, though the awareness of that contact remains broad and indistinct. Each step is placed with the same caution as before, though the confirmation now takes longer to settle. Balance holds, but it does so within a narrower margin, requiring the body to remain more contained. You watch as the others move within this same reduced pattern, their differences further diminished. Each figure has adjusted to a similar range, their movements aligning not through coordination, but through shared limitation. The spacing holds with less variation, maintained through the same quiet consistency. The environment offers no change in response. The trees remain fixed, their forms unchanged. The openness continues without variation. The air contains sound as it always has, holding everything within the same confined space. Nothing in the surroundings reflects the depth of the narrowing that has taken place. And yet, the movement continues. She steps forward again, the motion steady, contained, sustained within the same narrow limits. There is no attempt to extend beyond what can be held. No effort to recover what has been lost. The body moves within what remains, and that is enough to continue. A brief hesitation appears, not as a pause, but as a moment where the step slows further before completing. The body adjusts, redistributing weight with greater care, then resumes without interruption. These moments do not accumulate into difficulty. They are absorbed into the rhythm, shaping it without breaking it. You begin to understand that the body no longer measures what can be done in the same way. It does not look ahead to determine what is possible. It remains within what is already occurring, allowing movement to continue as long as it can be sustained within the present condition. The impressions left behind reflect this further reduction. They are closer still, more contained, forming a pattern that occupies less space with each step. The path does not extend outward. It continues forward within a narrower line. She maintains this movement, her form unchanged except for the quiet compression that has settled into it. The cold remains constant, integrated fully into the conditions that define what can continue. This is how the body endures the cold at its narrowest. Not by reaching beyond its limits, but by continuing within them. And as long as that continuation holds, the movement does not end. The space that remains. What remains is not what began. The space holds the same forms, the same trees, the same quiet openness that offers no direction and no change. The ground continues to receive each step without resistance beyond what has already been learned. The air maintains its steady pressure, containing sound, shaping breath, allowing nothing to extend beyond the immediate. And yet, what moves within this space is no longer what first entered it. She continues forward, though the motion has become nearly minimal. Each step is contained within the smallest possible range, the lift of the foot barely separating from the surface before settling again. The transfer of weight is slow, deliberate, requiring a moment of stillness within the movement itself. The rhythm remains, but it has thinned, reduced to what can continue without disruption. You notice how the body no longer adjusts in the same visible ways. The small corrections that once appeared, shifts in stance, refinements of grip, subtle changes in posture, have diminished. Not because they are no longer needed, but because they have been absorbed into the pattern itself. What remains is a form that holds its alignment without visible effort, maintained through repetition rather than response. The hands stay close, their position fixed. The feet move within the same narrow line, placing each step with a precision that no longer requires confirmation. The breath continues, though it remains quiet, contained, aligned with the minimal motion that defines each step. The others move within this same reduced condition, their forms nearly indistinguishable in their restraint. The spacing holds, though it no longer requires adjustment. Each figure maintains position through the same limited range, the same quiet continuation. The environment does not respond. The trees remain unchanged. The openness holds. The air continues its quiet containment. Nothing in the space reflects the narrowing that has taken place within the bodies moving through it. And yet, the difference is complete. You begin to understand that what remains is not a diminished version of what was. It is a different condition entirely. One that does not extend beyond itself. One that does not seek to change. One that continues only because it can. She pauses, though the stillness now appears almost identical to movement. The distinction between the two has thinned to the point where it no longer defines separate states. The body holds, then shifts, then holds again, all within the same narrow range. There is no clear beginning or end to either. The impressions left behind reflect this continuity. They are close together, evenly spaced, forming a line that does not expand outward, but persists forward within the same confined path. The surface records this without emphasis, holding the marks briefly before they begin to soften. You watch as the movement continues, not toward anything visible, not guided by anything that can be confirmed, but sustained through the same quiet repetition that has defined it from the beginning. This is what remains in the cold. Not strength. Not direction. Not certainty. Only continuation. And within that continuation, the space holds. What remains does not resolve. It continues without shifting into something clearer, without offering a point where the pattern can be understood as complete. The space holds the same quiet arrangement, and within it, movement persists in the smallest possible form. There is no change that signals an end. Only the continuation of what has already narrowed. She steps again, the motion nearly indistinguishable from the stillness that surrounds it. The lift is minimal, the placement precise, the transfer of weight slow and contained. The body does not reach beyond itself. It moves within the same limited range, sustaining what can be maintained without extension. You notice how the rhythm has settled into something that no longer varies. It does not rebuild. It does not adjust. It holds. The pauses that once marked transitions between states have dissolved into the movement itself. Each step carries its own stillness. Each moment of stillness carries the possibility of the next step. There is no separation between the two. The hands remain fixed, their position unchanged. The feet continue within the same narrow line, placing each step with a consistency that does not require attention. The breath persists, quiet and contained, aligned with the minimal motion that defines the body. The others remain within this same condition, their form steady, their spacing unchanged. There is no variation left to distinguish them. Each figure moves within the same confined pattern, sustained by the same quiet necessity. The environment offers nothing beyond what it has always held. The trees remain fixed in their repetition. The openness extends without variation. The air contains sound within the same narrow field. Nothing changes. And yet, something has been completed. Not in the sense of an outcome. Not in the sense of arrival. But in the full expression of what this condition can become. You watch as the impressions beneath their steps continue to form, close together, evenly spaced, marking a line that persists forward without expanding. These marks do not lead anywhere visible. They exist only as a record of continuation, held briefly before they soften and disappear. She continues forward, her form unchanged, her movement steady within its narrow limits. There is no attempt to alter the pattern. No effort to restore what was lost. The body remains within what it can sustain, and within that, it continues. The cold remains constant. The space remains unchanged. The movement persists. You begin to understand that this is not a moment within a larger progression. It is the condition itself, held fully, without variation, without resolution. This is how the space remains in the cold. Not through change, but through endurance. And within that endurance, everything that can continue does. After the cold has passed, the forest remains. Not as it was held in that narrow condition, but as something that continues beyond it, unchanged in form, altered only in how it is remembered. The trees still stand in their quiet repetition. The ground still carries the same pale surface, shaped by wind and time into patterns that do not hold direction. The air moves more freely now, though it retains no memory of what it once contained. There are no marks that remain long enough to be followed. What was pressed into the snow has softened, then disappeared, absorbed back into the surface that does not preserve passage. The lines that once indicated movement have faded without trace. The depressions that held stillness have risen again, returning the ground to its quiet uniformity. Nothing in the space reveals what it carried. And yet, something remains. Not within the forest. Not within the ground or the air. But in the way the space is understood. You walk through it now without noticing what has been removed. The distance resolves more easily. The trees hold their form. The ground offers its surface without resistance beyond what can be managed. Breath moves freely, uncontained, extending beyond the immediate. Sound travels again, though it carries nothing of what was once held in silence. The cold no longer defines what can continue. It has passed, not through departure, but through the quiet return of everything it once reduced. What remains is not visible. It does not mark the trees or alter the ground. It does not exist as a trace that can be followed. It exists in the understanding of what it required, of how movement was shaped, how stillness was held, how the body narrowed into what could continue. These do not return with the same clarity. They settle instead into something quieter, something that does not need to be recalled directly to remain present. The forest holds no record. The space offers no reflection. The cold leaves nothing behind. And yet, the condition remains, not as something that can be seen, but as something that has already been carried. You stand at the edge of it now, though there is no clear boundary to mark where it ends. The trees continue. The ground extends. The air moves freely. Nothing signals that this place once held anything different. But you know that it did. Not through what remains in the space, but through what no longer needs to be held. And in that quiet absence, the understanding settles. The cold did not change the forest. It changed what could remain within it. And even now, long after it has passed, that remains the only thing it leaves behind. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.